G'day guys. This is a clip that I actually wanted to do for some time, but I didn't get around doing it. It's going to be part of a theme going back to the early hominins and coming forward. But I've sort of sat on this for some time, and so I've basically decided to do it today. It's about the ancient Greeks and Greeks of later eras and what they ate and what they really ate. It was sort of going to be a continuation on my chats with Bart in regards to the Mediterranean diet, the real Mediterranean diet of the Greeks, not the Ansel Keys fabricated nonsense. So that was my aim, but this is sort of looking at a study that was done about 16 months ago. It's a continuation of an excavation in an archaeological site in the northern part of the Peloponnese, which has been done by led by a Greek academic, and she's been assisted by a group out of Cornell University. And they've been basically focused on trying to look at what people in this locality, which hasn't changed a lot because the genetics are more stable in this locality, unlike other parts of Greece where there's been far more movement. This was one area where there was less population that was sort of coming and going and changing in any rapid way. So we've got a sort of a settlement that is long in history and stable population, and so you would expect that the actual dietary approaches of these people should be similar, and if they change we should see stable isotope analysis data showing that. And the other thing that the stable isotope analysis and the carbon sort of delta 13 sort of carbon isotope analysis as well should show the sort of variations and other inclusions or exclusions of certain plants or other types of foods in the diet. So I would say it's a much better study in that regard, even though some of the participants do tend to have a bit of a plant-based background, and they tend to be a bit biased in the way they actually interpret their own data. We'll sort of ignore that part because, it's sort of the reality that a lot of academia has been infiltrated by these shady characters, and even when they do good science, they sort of try to come up with a whole lot of very weird and strange hypotheses or opinions, and that's the word, opinions, why the data may be what it is, and maybe we should be interpreting it slightly differently, or this or that. It's a sort of typical sort of approach. Okay, now let's look at this area. So basically this is the academic that did the work, well, the leader of the actual group, Dr. Dora Katsonopoulou. And Katsonopoulou is based out of the Athens University. I believe she lectures also at Cornell as well. And so they are looking at this site in Greece, and they're looking from this Helike, which is the name of this population, from an early part of 2500 BC. So we're talking about 4,500 years ago, right through to the classical era, the Roman era, and then the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium era. So they're sort of looking at engaging sort of changes in dietary approaches of that population, and what were the if any changes that had happened. So this is an interview she gave about this site, so if anybody wants to go and check it out, I'll put the URL up so people can go and check that out, and get some background information about the site. So we'll just pan down just to look at the location. So this is the actual location. Oops. In the north of the Peloponnese. The region is called Achaea. It's north of Achaea, which is a sort of a central component. This is Laconia, the south, where Sparta is, and the old areas of, Pylos on the west coast here in Messenia, which is where some of the heroes that went to the Trojan War came from. Argos is obviously the area where further north of there is Mycene. So this is pretty much the ancient heartland of a lot of the Greek population. To the east is Athens in Attica. So that's sort of just to give you a sort of an idea, navigate. It's basically smack in the northern part of the Peloponnese, but smack in the centre of Greece, the mainland Greece, that is. So we're basically looking at a population that is far more stable in that regard historically. Was less involved in as much warfare as the Spartans or the Athenians or the Thebes or other areas. So we don't see as much in terms of genetic shift as much as we may see in other areas where there were far more conquering that happened, and slaves were taken. Obviously, when you take slaves, there will be times when these people become free citizens and incorporate in your society. Genetic makeup of that society will shift even within the same racial group. So this is sort of looking at a much more stable group over time, which can be quite helpful. So now this is the actual site, plan of the site. Let me just control that because, oops, bit of overcorrection. So we're actually looking at early Hellenistic. So the terminology, just to explain things, and the word Hellenistic. The Greek word for Greeks or Greece is Hellas, or Hellenistic, or Hellenic. So we call ourselves Hellenic Republic. So in Greek, that would be Elliniki Demokratia, or and this would be Hellenistic period, Hellenistiki periodo, and this is the sort of pre-classical era, proklassiki periodo, and that's the classical era, which we all know, where the great philosophers of ancient Greece and a lot of the the Persian Greek wars took place in this period. So this is when the Athenians created their empire. So it's a well-known period. Hellenistic period is post Alexander the Great, when a lot of his generals carved up his empire and pretty much created their own power areas. One of the well-known out of his generals was Ptolemy of Egypt. So that's just a sidekick. And then they look at the Roman era. So they're looking at the Roman era, both the pre-Christian era and then the period where you've got the Christian period. So those sort of that switch over as well. So it's quite informative in looking at, so they're looking at the animals in the area. They're looking at all sorts of actual information So they're actually not only analysing humans, but they're also analysing a lot of the animals and vegetation and fauna that exist in that area in order to ascertain exactly what sort of things were basically being consumed and the sort of interaction between humans and animals within that area, which is quite important to sort of get an understanding of what are the dietary approaches, what are people doing over time within that region. And so let's just move on to the actual study itself so we can actually look at details of that study. Yep, okay, that's come up. Just give me a sec. I just need to make adjustments so we can zoom in a bit so we can get a better sort of look and feel. Oops, a bit more. That's about it. We won't go any further because... Okay, so it's pretty much the diet of the ancient Helike of Achaea of Greece, and they're looking at the stable isotope analysis from that period, the plus the Hellenistic, Roman and Byzantine periods. So they've sort of added that as well to their study. There was an original study that actually just focused on the older period, but this recent study sort of has gone that next step and sort of added additional information to that. There's also some of the contributors that are involved in here are also from the University of Alberta. So there's a few people from some Canadians that are involved in this actual study. In the previous one, I believe there was the Cornell people. So, but I don't want to focus on the previous study because a lot of the information is within this study, plus some additional information about the sort of what has actually happened to that population over time, and which is very important because we get a lot of pushback that this is the Mediterranean diet. People consume these foods for a very long time from antiquity. This is the healthiest sort of diet, and so we get a lot of that sort of stuff where a lot of people don't realise that is more a modern construct rather than really the actual original Greek diet. So, and we need these sort of studies to really look back and see exactly how the diet has evolved and what it really was. So let's move to the next part. So basically the abstract of this talks about the era that they're actually looking at, they're focusing on, which is around they provide information for earlier periods, but their main focus of this study is right smack in the classical era, which is 373 BC. So that's within the classical era, which is good because that's the sort of stuff we want, because this is the late classical era. And so we get also the other sort of connotations. Well, they're trading with the Phoenicians, they're trading with a whole lot of other populations. They are introducing a whole lot of other foods into the diet. That's probably a bit true with the Athenians, but less true with most other Greeks. And that's why this is a real good study, because it's focusing on a population which is less exposed to foreign influence in terms of diet. We could say the same thing in cities, modern cities of many countries, developing countries around the world, where you've got more Americanized type, dietary approaches, McDonald's and all this sort of influences coming in and sort of changing the landscape. Where if you go to rural areas and smaller cities and towns, that's not the case. The traditions hold far more. So this is sort of an important because it's the big centres like Athens, Corinth, were the big trading centres. Many of the other areas, which is probably 90% of the Greek population, weren't eating like the Athenians or the Corinthians. So this is why it's a good study, because it doesn't include that sort of, small segment of the population that had slight diversity to its diet. And that's important because a lot of, that sort of confounds a lot of the information coming from the past. And a lot of the information comes from anecdotes, historical recollection, discussions of things of trade, which doesn't really tell you exactly what people were actually eating even in those cities, because unless you do isotope analysis on, bone collagen and stuff like that, to actually really see what are the isotopes, what exactly were they eating, you really don't know. You're just speculating. And that's what a lot of academics unfortunately do nowadays. It's all about, as Bart would say, publish or perish. Put as much junk out there as possible, because at the end of the day, it's more studies than anything else. In the past, people would do, people would work in research labs and probably publish, 4 or 5 studies in their whole life. Now it's thousands. It's just all junk science. Questionnaires and sort of surveys and stuff like that, opinion pieces and reviews, and it goes on, and reviews of reviews, and opinions of reviews, and it's a mess. It doesn't really tell you anything. It's the lowest common denominator. It's the lowest source of evidence because it's not based on data, it's based on opinion. But it helps people with academic tenure, and it also helps institutions charge more, because if they can get better academic ranking as an institution, they can charge more money for what they provide. So, this is the way they approach things. So people just need to remind themselves of that reality. Now let's just go. So they, in their introduction, they just go through a bit of a, diet and nutrition play an important role in the health of human communities. So their normal blah blah about, what the past utilization of local food resources can help us understand the interaction between people and their environment, and mediated by cultural and individual factors. So they're just talking about that locality and the people there, and the environmental push factors and access to what they have in that surround, which is a good thing because it actually tells you what the Greek world is more like and what is more likely to be accessible. As I've said, Greece is quite an arid sort of country. It doesn't have a lot of lowlands or areas where you can actually get a lot of grain agriculture. It's very limited. There's a few places in parts of central northern Greece, but there's not many parts. Greece is basically 85% mountainous. It's really pastoral, meat based, and it has been for a very long time. But unfortunately, when Ansel Keys turned up after the Second World War, most of the country was devastated. The occupation authorities had taken a lot of the animals away. They'd confiscated the animals for the troops and removed them. And, up to about, people believe, it depends on who you ask, but the figure is potentially up to as many as 600,000 people died from starvation in Greece in the war years. And that's a horrendous amount when you consider that the population was about 6 odd million. So we're talking about 10% of your population literally succumbing to extreme starvation and dying. So we'll just move on to the real juicy stuff. So they talk about some of the past studies there, which is very unimportant. Who cares? A lot of them are biased opinions. They're not based on isotope analysis. They're based on opinions and speculation. So pretty much to be ignored. I ignore those because unless you've got some hard data, why are you bothering me with your opinions? Your opinions mean nothing to me. Data is only the real gold nugget that actually tells you exactly what people were eating. So that gives you a bit of an overview of where this locality is. So it's within just off the Gulf of Corinth, and more or less centrally, if you think about central north of the Peloponnese. So that's the region of the Peloponnese, and you can see the other big cities like Corinth and Athens are not too far away in that regard, but significant away in distance to not have too much of an effect, especially in those days. I mean, Greece really didn't have many modern roads. Donkeys and other animals were used to sort of transport stuff, horses and donkeys and mules, for a very long time. And it was really after the Second World War that, with Marshall Plan funding and the military building up its engineering corps, was able to build a lot of the roads for the first time and actually open up large parts of the interior of the country, which meant for the first time that newfangled foods were able to penetrate into localities which had never seen these foods. So that's an important factor to understand how since the 1950s and onwards, the Greek so-called Mediterranean diet sort of evolved, which is very important to understand that, and that's only what we're talking about 70 years ago. We're talking the last 70 years. We really have to look back to really understand what the real diet that gave longevity to these people was, not the sort of nonsense that we're told about nowadays. Okay. Yeah. Oops. Let's go back up here. Sorry guys, it's a bit hard to sort of manage this. Okay, so they're just talking about the material methods. They're talking about a bit about the locality, and Helike is located in the southwest coast of the Gulf of Corinth in northern Peloponnese, approximately 90 kilometres west of Corinth. The site consists of coastal plain bordered by mountains to the south and the Gulf of Corinth to the north. So that gives you an idea. The sort of surrounds it's sort of a slightly elevated area with some plains in the coastal areas, which people would have been able to access some seafood and stuff like that in the shallow sort of water areas. And that will be drawn out with the data showing that. So the sample preparation, this is a bit fickly, this tool. Okay, so isotope results on, God almighty. Sorry guys, this program is a bit on the fickly side, and it just makes it very hard to control. Okay. We don't want the results, we want the preparatory stuff. So, collagen was extracted from the bone samples using methods outlined by Ambrose 1990. So and Silly 1986 and 2014. So these are methods that are used by archaeologists that are well recognised, and if somebody wants to go and check out the methodology, that more than I'll basically be posting a link to this study, so people can just go and check out those different studies and get some idea of the exact methodology that they used. For each sample, approximately 3 grams of bone was cleared both mechanically and ultrasonically to remove surface dirt. So they're using a number of methods to basically both remove it, but also to basically keep the sample clean and clear of any contamination. So subsamples of approximately 500 milligrams were dried at room temperature for a maximum of 24 hours. hours. Let me just move that slowly up without overshooting. Weighed and then demineralized in a 1%. It's basically they're using hydrochloric acid to demineralize the actual bone solution. So, yeah. And so they can actually extract the resulting collagen. Pseudomorphs were then soaked in 0.125. I'm not sure what that means. I can't remember. Sodium hydroxide and the solution for 20 hours to remove any humic acid soil contaminants. So they did, they basically just cleared the whole thing of all contaminants, all bacteria, all, any sort of crap that could be there to basically give us a false result based on Ambrose 1990 methodology. So that's what the samples were rinsed to a neutral pH in distilled water, freeze-dried, and then analysed by the biogeochemical laboratories at the University of Alberta. So, they were done at a facility that has some of the latest equipment in that regard. So, we can rely that the data is done pretty well in terms of delta 13. Oops, just push that up. Both in terms of delta 13 carbon values and the actual delta 15 nitrogen values as well. So, so the collagen quality was determined from atomic CN ratio sample, carbon percentage, nitrogen percentage content, and collagen yield using generally accepted ranges by, again, Ambrose 1993, De Niro 1985, Van Klinken, who's a German, Dutch, 1999. And so, these are some of the latest methods and approaches to the way they go about it. So what we'll do now is we'll actually look at the actual tables themselves. I'm not going to read the results and stuff like that because it's meaningless to people in that regard, unless you're trained in some of these sciences. What we want to see is the actual results, what we're actually getting, what is actually resulting from this work. So let's just zoom down. So there are actually the actual site chart. So they've actually got marked the Byzantine burials, the Roman burials, the Hellenistic burials. So they're actually looking at all these different burials from different eras and all that. So they're taking separate samples from all these areas, and they've identified them clearly that they are, because obviously, with the Byzantium burials there, you've got the crosses, they're quite clearly marked as Christian graves. So we know what they are. Now, in terms of the tables, they're looking at all. Let me just bring this up slowly so I don't overshoot. Bear with me. So they're actually looking at table 1. They're actually looking at the Helike people. They're looking at also comparing other populations as well in that area, both, Corinthian and cows and pigs and stuff like that, which is very important because, for comparative purposes. And they're looking at all the animals as well, which is important as well, because you can actually then discern, what is the makeup of these animals. And when you see similar sort of isotopes, you can actually work out, you can analyse the data a bit better. So now, they say that there is temporal variations in the Helike humans of delta 13 carbon and delta 15 nitrogen values is portrayed in figure 4. we'll go to that in a minute. This means the time period shown in table 2, so which is the one that we're looked on the right hand side, which goes right through from the era, the early era, classical era, Roman era, Byzantium era being the final one down here. So we can actually see the sort of values. If we just go, just back up as I'm going up here. As you can see, the values, the shifting in the values. There's not a massive difference. There is no massive sort of difference, and even they're looking at these different age groups as well, from 18 to 35 or 50 plus, and all that. And you can actually see the sort of both values. There is not a considerable massive change, and the delta isotope analysis are quite pretty high, which is fairly good. As you can see, Corinthian goats and sheep are quite low, obviously, because they're consuming far more vegetation and stuff like that. So it's sort of important. Now let's move it down, because looking at it plotted out is much better. So let's look at the first one. So as you can see here, the actual values show a picture which is quite dramatic. So if you look at the actual animals that are there in that area, cows, pigs, sheep, deer, pigs, both Corinthian and non-Corinthian and stuff like that, you can actually see that their delta 15 is much lower, and they're also shifted to in the other direction. So basically, the sort of food or plants that are being consumed by the animals are quite different from those of humans, let alone humans are not really consuming many plants, as you can see in this sort of information. The sort of plants we would consider sort of to be in normal range. But the thing that the stark contrast here is the Helike human and the Corinthian dog. We're in the carnivore range, guys. Can you see it? That is the carnivore range. And I'll just actually show this is basically from something that I've sort of copied from another MD doctor, Michael Eads. Some people may know him. He does a lot of contributions in the paleo, keto, and sort of low carb community. He actually wrote a book called Protein Power years ago. So anybody that sort of is of that era, we're talking about 70s and all that, would remember sort of Michael Eads. Now he's actually done here showing early human diet and doing a comparison between horses, deers, the Arctic fox, which is sort of 5.5 more or less. You can see this group of humans, this group of Homo sapiens in this region, their levels about 6, the delta 15, which puts them in sort of a range of what we would consider 6 and above, sort of super carnivores, or quite carnivorous. The majority of their calories are coming from the carnivore diet. Now when we switch back to this information, the lowest one is at 7. Where their highest is about slightly above the 8. The rest of it's 9, 10, 10 and a half, in these very high levels, large, there's a lot of concentration here between 10 and 8. So you can actually see there's, the population is very carnivorous in comparison. This is in the range of what we would call hypercarnivores, not merely super carnivores. We see similar levels amongst some of the Neanderthal populations, which we know were hypercarnivores, up in those sort of levels. So this is really high carnivory. This is not basically, plant eaters. This is not basically the sort of nonsense that we got from the Game Changers about, a bunch of Roman slaves that were eating slop. Well, they're expendable. Why would you feed them high quality food? They get into the arena. If they survive, they survive. If they don't, they're dead the next day. You're not going to be basically feeding them high quality foods. On top of that, they used to be a bit fat. They used to have a bit of body fat on them, and that sort of helped them with infections, because when you cut with a knife through that sort of fattier tissue, it heals better. So these were basically, overweight, they weren't obese, they were overweight guys, eating primarily carbs that were just going in there and getting themselves knocked off, and the ones that survived were able to sort of recover so they could actually go back and fight the next day, so it's, that's, people want a slave diet and they want to be plump and slave-like. Go for it. We'll throw you into an arena as well. But they do have Big Brother and all that, those sort of arenas, don't they? The modern style where they cut them with their tongue rather than with a sword. So it's the same sort of BS, in that regard. These were slaves. They weren't well fed. They were expendable. So let's get over it. It's just nonsense to basically. These were warriors. These were hypercarnivore warriors. They could go out there and defeat millions of Persians, annihilate them. So those bread eaters, they used to call the actual Egyptians bread eaters, artophagos, as an insult. My ancestors were hypercarnivores, and they were basically great warriors that the world trembled when they were on the battlefield. So, all bunch of nonsense that the vegetards keep on promoting. So just keep that in mind. And as you can see, even the Delta 13, which is looking at the sort of plants, are very different. We're not eating like the ruminants. Not even that. So even if there was a few plants, it's very different what we're consuming. It's probably some herbs and spices and stuff like that just to make the food, slightly more enjoyable. Now, let's look at, overshot. Now, this is an important period as well. So when we look at these sort of different periods, we can actually see that in the Roman period, we've slightly shifted, and in the Byzantine period, we've slightly shifted to the left. They're still in the hypercarnivore range, the majority. So you've basically got the Helike people, which that are on the right-hand side, and we can see that basically they are primarily, consuming an ancestral diet. And then we can see basically in the Roman era, the level of carnivory comes down slightly between the 8 and 9. There is somebody down at 7, but that's just a one-off. But they've also shifted slightly to the left, so they are consuming some grains, some Roman type foods. It's not a lot, but there would be some there in the diet. That is to be expected. That they're interacting, but primarily still they're in the actual range. What is dramatic is once the Western Roman Empire gets split between the Roman west and east, and the Byzantium sort of era takes root, we can see that basically some of these people have gravitated back to their traditional diet practices to the right, and some have even become even more carnivorous than the Roman period, as you can see, groups. So here's, you've got 2 data points close to the Romans, and then you've got 3 and 3, 6, which, you know, in all accounts, that's 75% of the of those data points are basically going back either to their traditional diet or becoming even more carnivorous than their traditional diet. So, you know, that's another, you know, oh, the Christian era, they were eating a whole lot of legumes and all that. Oh, another falsehood, another mistake. Maybe they were eating a few, because it is to the left, this group here. So you're looking at basically out of that sort of population group, you're looking at a proportion that's actually shifted. There's only really, because even these other ones are slightly to the centre, there's only one which is quite carnivorous up here, close to 10, that is more to the left within that sort of stock step of consuming probably a few more legumes and stuff like that. But it's small. It's not a dramatic you know, increase, but it's, you know, it's noteworthy, but it's not statistically important. And the next sort of you know, diagram will sort of indicate sort of what are the sort of the food concentrations, and this is important, you know, that we actually look. You know, you can ignore the discussion. The discussion is just absolute dribble of opinions and more opinions, and completely ignoring their own data. That's how bad it is. But what there's not much to expect from modern academia, unfortunately. They just ignore their own bloody data. You know, they put their data up and then they just ignore it. You know, so here we've got figure 5. Helike human collagen values adjusted 1 tropic value down and plotted against estimated general resource values from this sort of researchers actually looked at that area, and so they've actually combined their study with this other researcher who basically you know, has done, you know, sort of research into basically what's in the region, you know. So so you've got the isotope analysis on the one hand, and then you've got what are the things that are primarily in that region, and sort of combining them to get a better picture of what are the sort of foods that the data that we just saw is actually sort of pushing towards what. So as we can see, you know, C3 grains and legumes, which is to the left, is basically doesn't even have a data point. It's so statistically insignificant. So as I showed above, in the Byzantine period, which was in the Eastern Roman Empire, basically there was just one data point, was just slightly to the left, but not significantly to the left. And that's important, you know. So yes, they may have had a few, some grains, some legumes, you know, C3 grains and legumes, but, you know, we're talking about very minuscule type things, you know. And sort of the other C4 grains, you know, even those, not there, not an issue either. Large fish, obviously, we don't have oceans in the Mediterranean, and these were coastal. And even today, most fishermen, even on the islands, just do coastal fishing in small little fishing boats. So there are no large fishing boats, so it's primarily small fish. And this is what the data is actually showing. There's a bit of small fish, both in the Roman era and in the Hellenistic era. But when we look at the actual Byzantium era, you know, we're talking about Christians here, wouldn't you think they'd be eating more fish? Apparently not. They are actually eating far more, you know, domesticated animals. And and even the Romans actually, Roman period, they had far more domesticated animals, while the period of the Hellenistic period consumed. We don't have from the Helike period, but we know that they're very carnivorous, so we know that they'd be eating very similar foods. So as you can see through both the ancestral stuff, right through Hellenistic period, post-Alexander, Roman period, and then the actual Eastern Roman Empire period, it's pretty much consistent for thousands upon thousands of years. We're talking about 4,000 years of history where primarily the food of the Greeks was domesticated animals, pigs, goats, and sheep. That was primarily what we consumed, and we still consume those foods today, with some dairy thrown in from those animal sources. So it's really a sort of a rich dairy and domestic animal sort of sources of food to this day, largely. I think at one of my live chats, I actually showed you organ meats and kukurezi, which is a sort of a favourite way of actually preparing organ meats and combining them together and then roasting them over coal and then basically cutting them in small little bite pieces. Really beautiful. You put a bit of lemon juice in it and some oregano and salt and pepper. Oh God, they're divine. I could devour half of that piece. Really nice. So that that's really what my ancestors ate for a long time. I mean, I sort of saw the tail end of that in the 70s when I was living in Greece in the late 70s and early 80s and did my high school there and sort of got exposed to that food and, the sort of dairy and organ meats type, nose to tail sort of dietary approach and, with certain other foods as well thrown in, which was sort of delicacies like snails are delicacies over there. A number of the fish, seasonal fish like squid and octopus. You don't have it every day, and even on the islands you don't have it every day. It's the occasional time when you have seafood. We're not like the Japanese heavy into seafood. It's just, the occasional, small little meals and stuff like that, or sometimes small treats. So you may have a main meal and then have a bit of seafood on the side as well, sometimes pickled and stuff like that. And sort of those sort of combinations. It'd be more dairy we would consume rather than consuming seafood to the same extent. So that's pretty much a rundown, a good idea of what the real diet has been, and and up until and even after the fall of the Constantinople's and the Eastern Roman Empire, even then, in the last 400 odd years, I mean, pretty much the diet hadn't changed a lot. My mother, told me a bit about the past, and so did my father. I think my father even helped his mother with larding and sort of creating lard for the winter, so they would have pig's fat, so they could actually cook their food. Because, there were no roads, and trying to bring, olive oil from the lower lands or whatever is just impossible, and that's a joke. And actually, there wasn't large amounts of olive oil. And a lot of the olive oil, like even on the islands, was actually used for lighting. See, a lot of oils were actually used to light up the cities, because oils were traditionally, even in antiquity, this was what the first oil war between the Athenian Empire, primarily Corinth, Athens, and a few others that controlled a lot of the trade of the olive oil trade. This is one reason why the Persians invaded Greece. It was the first oil war. We were, in this case, they were the empire, and we were basically the equivalent of the oil Arabs that controlled most of that trade. And it was primarily to light up cities. Up until, you think about whaling, you think about early uses of of oil, even from vegetable oil, was used primarily for lanterns and to actually provide lighting in cities. That was its purpose, primarily. It wasn't basically as a food. Even the Americans in the 19th up until the early part of the 20th century still consumed a lot of lard, still consumed a lot of butter. I mean, Europeans would travel to America and say America is awash in butter. I mean, we think about the French today, but actually 19th and early 20th century Americans consumed more butter than the French back then. So, it was only after when, crude oil and, petrochemical products took over and sidelined these cheap, oils, and some of, Crisco and some of these companies that were involved sort of pushed these cheap oils onto the population, and then with the Great Depression and poverty, they took root in the population because people gravitated towards them because they were cheap. It's like a lot of people now gravitate to a lot of cheap fast foods for the same reason. In the US, where there's a lot of like food deserts, and people sort of find these as easy sources of cheap calories. It's the same sort of situation. So that's why I call it all junk food 2.0, all this newfangled crap, which is taking root at the moment after our GFC and which reduced. I mean, the stock market may be doing fine for some, but for the majority of the population, they're not doing as well. They're on struggle street. They're doing it hard. So, and when they're bombarded by the media with a lot of propaganda, they are tending to shift towards these things, these dietary practices. We need to make them aware of our ancestral dietary practices, and that there's a lot of nonsense that's out there. Like even here, they actually look at, these sort of areas where they say this could be taken as suggesting that dietary protein came almost exclusively from animal sources. The documentary archaeological evidence reviewed in Section 2 makes it extremely unlikely that most of the protein of this protein come from meat. So here they're actually speculating. They go, dairy products are more plausible choice. So they're throwing in dairy, that it must be all dairy, the vegetarian sort of angle. No, it's not. Yes, there is dairy, but we don't consume massive amounts of dairy like the Maasai. They consume massive, even though they consume, organ meats and animal flesh and all that, but they actually consume a disproportionate amount, like 3.5 to 5.5 litres of milk a day. Greeks don't do that. They never have. It's primarily our dairies coming from some milk consumption and some feta cheese consumption. That's where it's primarily coming from. So, this is an exaggeration. It's just basically trying to find plausible reasons why this could be the case. So, but at the end of the day, I go, even if somebody was to argue this point, I go, well, and it's still an animal source of food. It's still primarily animal source. Just because it's dairy, it's still animal food. It still makes these people hypercarnivores because they're still consuming primarily animal foods. So what's your point? When we look at heavy consumption of legumes, which typically the delta 15 N value around 0 would be expected to cause much lower human delta 15 N values than those seen here. So they're actually admitting here that basically, if these people consuming a heavy legume diet, these delta 15 values should be much lower. They should be considerably lower, but that's not the case. And then they go on to about fertilizers and cultivation methods, and maybe that has changed things. Well, show us the data that proves that. I can't, I've looked. It doesn't exist. This is just idle speculation. It's, again, an inability to accept reality, that basically most of our diet was polluted and modified by a whole lot of nutritionists who came in with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, supposedly to save us, to help us poor Greeks, regain, our diet, No, what they wanted to do is impose their own dietary approaches and sell us grain and seed oils. That was basically it. That's what they basically wanted to do. It was all about making money for the US exporters. The Marshall Plan was all about that. Had two prongs. One, keep the Soviets out of Europe because impoverished Europeans may turn to the Russians. And on the other hand, was let's flood American products into Europe and basically make a lot of this sort of stuff. That was basically it. So don't fall for the bullshit. It's propaganda, and we've had a gutful of it for decades, So that's pretty much a bit of a rundown. The data never lies. Ignore opinion, because opinion is not science. Data is only the only reliable thing we've got to go on, and nothing else. And so that data is quite clear. What is our real ancestral diet and what makes a difference to human health? So don't be tricked. Please post this share it around, post it on your Facebook page and wherever else you can. And please like and subscribe to my channel, and support me so I can actually do more of these sort of videos, which basically demystifies and puts the bullshit to the side and actually shows the real evidence, that what the real data is actually showing, and what these charlatans are doing to our health. That's what we need to get out there. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll keep on making a few more now that I've got a bit of wind and got myself going. Anyway, see you shortly in the live stream.